The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at www.mtsu.edu/CEM.
Our first session today, Sarah Hendricks is here from the Tennessee Department of Education. The collaborative makes a concerted effort to partner with the Tennessee Department of Education so that we are aligned with what they're doing and they are aware of what we're doing. And so we're so glad you're here today. And I will let you introduce yourself, okay?
Okay, wonderful.
So glad you're here.
Thank you, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to meet all of you. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm so excited to be here. This is a great event. I always encourage everyone, content, ESL teachers, to come to these events because it's such great learning surrounding our work and also really great learning for content teachers to learn about how to engage English language learners. So that's what we're going to talk about today is scaffolding of content for English learners in our content instruction. And I'm just going to give you some brief ideas about how to best scaffold, ways to connect and have those really great conversations in the classroom, connecting students to the content, engaging them with those high quality instructional materials, and just kind of the process to walk through to be able to do that. I know a lot of people in here, you guys are the experts, and I call on you guys all the time because it takes a village, right? All of us working together to come up with some of these great ideas and great instructional strategies. So this is going to be a little bit more collaborative. I'm going to give you opportunities to talk amongst yourselves and to share things out if you would like to during the presentation. And then, of course, we'll have time for question and answer after. So just a little background on me. I'm the ELL coordinator for the state, and I work in the Office of Academics. My division is Special Education and Intervention Programs, formerly known as Special Populations. So within our department, we have myself, we have a gal that does characteristics of dyslexia. She works primarily on that. We have a director of intervention. We have Joanne Runyon, who is our director. And then we have our assistant commissioner, Jennifer Jordan, who couldn't be here today. But we have an awesome team. And I'm just so encouraged to see all of you here. Last week, we had an awesome Standards Crosswalk working group with a lot of faces in this room. So it's really fun to be here and see everyone again. Okay, so this is our strategic plan for Tennessee, the best for all. And when I look at this, I just think about how scaffolding hits all three of these points. Academics, our educators, how we will facilitate instruction, being more like a guide instead of being the primary expert of the content, but guiding our students. And student readiness, right, preparing them for life beyond the classroom. So let's talk about what is scaffolding. Whenever I think of scaffolding, when I was first new to education, I always thought of this picture right here, right? A scaffold that we use for a building. And so if you think about that, as we're building a new building and we have all the scaffolds in place, as the building is built, it slowly gets torn away. And that's what scaffolding is. It's a temporary framework, right, to support a work crew. So as a student gains that proficiency in both English and in the content, we're going to take away these scaffolds. They're not going to be lifers in any of these scaffolds that we're talking about today because they're meant to be temporary and taken away as they gain mastery over the content. So a little brief history on scaffolding. Scaffolding is, I would say relatively new. In the late 1970s, the idea of scaffolding in education was introduced. That term was coined. And Jerome Bruner, he is a child psychologist in child development, and he kind of coined this term, talking about how it pertains to a child's language acquisition. So we know as children that framework for how we learn language often comes from our parents. They're our first examples of how to speak. And so they're providing that initial framework, and it's not always, if any of you have ever used Rosetta Stone before, it's not like we say, okay, global, balloon, right? We don't just do the translation. We actually show a balloon, then we say balloon, balloon, Let the kid play with the balloon, and eventually they learn that that is a balloon, right? It's the same thing how we acquire language. And so that initial framework, as you attain more and more vocabulary in English, you're able to eventually put together phrases and sentences, talk in paragraphs, have conversations. So he's really the idea of scaffolding, and it was more pertaining to language acquisition. And he agreed that students really need to be their own facilitators of education, that the teacher's just there as a guide. So they discover the links and the relationships between facts by experiential learning, by experiencing it. And rather than the teacher just telling them concepts and theories, they get to discover that on their own with the teacher as a support. Same way that our parents help us learn things in the home, right? Family, that's how we best learn. So his goal with education is, he always said, the goal is to create autonomous learners. We don't want anyone that is just being spoon-fed, right, everything that we learn, but we need teachers to be the guides and the facilitators and to help students attain that mastery themselves, to become stronger in the content area and be able to show that proficiency themselves. So in that same vein, what scaffolding does is it equips the student, right? It helps them to do something beyond what they could do independently, and it gives them that framework, almost like stair steps. Slowly, slowly, they're gaining more and more proficiency in the language, simultaneously gaining more proficiency in that content area. So it's equipping them to do something beyond what maybe they could do independently. They have that frame of support. It also supports their access to meaning when they're acquiring new language. So as teachers, with all students, there's a lot of academic vocabulary that's unfamiliar to our students in the regular gen ed classroom that are English-only speakers. So we're providing that support and helping them gain access to that meaning, whether that be through showing pictures, demonstrating, total physical response. We do this for all learners, not just our English learners. It builds on that prior knowledge. I always say, if you can connect your learning to something that a student really loves and enjoys, they're really tuned in, right? I used to teach a group of I had one girl, and they're like 15 high school boys, all English language learners, and they love soccer, right? So everything I did, if I could tie it to soccer, if we could read an article on Pele, or if we could read an article on Messi, that's what we did, because I wanted to engage their interest and help them to really connect with what we were learning and still be able to build their skills like reading comprehension and vocabulary, but doing it in a way that builds upon something they're familiar with, right? They already have a knowledge about. And then providing opportunities for them to be successful, building that self-efficacy, feeling like, oh man, I'm doing so well. Look at how I did 2 weeks ago compared to now. And then 2 more weeks go by. Oh my gosh, I know so much more now than I did then 2 weeks ago. So building that self-efficacy, just like the scaffolds we looked at on that first picture, right? Slowly, slowly kind of helping them gain that confidence in themselves to be able to access that content and achieve all their goals with language learning. So back to Bruder's theory of development, he had 3 different stages, right? And the first one is contingency. So that is when the support is provided to the extent that it's needed. We're not just giving them every resource and saying, okay, here's the answers, right? But we're providing them the support that's needed. And this is going to be highly dependent on what we know about the student. So how well do you know your student according to data, those formative and summative assessments that you're giving in the classroom, but also their personality, their need. One thing that we encounter a lot as teachers of English learners is there's a lot of different cultural or systemic or just personality preferences, things that we encounter with our students that we need to take into consideration. Maybe your student is not comfortable up in front of a classroom, but they're able to demonstrate their knowledge in a different way, right? And so taking all those things into consideration, because some people are not comfortable with certain tasks, but helping facilitate that learning, helping them feel comfortable and providing support where needed. It's temporary, so as they gain competence, we're reducing that level of support, right? And then there's ultimately a transfer of responsibility. Eventually that student has mastered the content, their language proficiency is at the level it needs to be at to be able to access that content and show proficiency, and so we release our hands, right? We say, okay, you're on your own, fly away little birdie, right? It's a transfer of responsibility, providing that support to the learner until they're able to do it themselves. So why do we scaffold? Well, one, it helps us meet our objectives. We all have standards, content that we need to teach, and without scaffolds, it's simply impossible for some of our students to be able to access that content. So we provide those temporary supports to provide that access, help them gain those skills needed, and then, as they gain competency, they're able to show that proficiency on their own without so much teacher intervention and so much help. It also allows the teacher to be a facilitator, like we talked about, right? More of a guide towards learning. So it takes the pressure off you to be the expert in all things, right? And kind of transfer a little bit of that responsibility to the student and say, maybe I don't know the answer to this, but let's research it together. Let's look it up together. Let's figure this out together. So many wonderful ESL teachers, as you know, they cover multiple grade spans. It's impossible for all of us to know every single piece of content that those students are learning. So sometimes it's us engaging with those high quality instructional materials, talking to their content teachers, and investigating what the answer might be together, right, with the student. And taking that pressure off yourself to be the know-all and have all the answers and be the expert, but really help facilitate that learning as a guide. That also helps build rapport with your students, right? They don't feel like you're intimidating. There's already that intimidation factor because of the language barrier. But taking off that facilitation, that intimidation of, I am the teacher, I'm authoritarian, you must respect me. Of course, they need to respect you as their teacher. But a lot of times respect is given, it's earned, right? It's only given after it's been shown to someone. So those students, especially in the high school, I felt like, sugar over vinegar. I gained a lot more respect, and I was able to engage with them in the content once they felt comfortable with me as the teacher, right? It lowers our need for student intervention. So we know that in conjunction with our access points from our high quality instructional materials and providing those scaffolds, that it's reducing our ultimate need for Tier 1 intervention in the form of modifications and accommodations on those ILPs, IEPs, and 504 plans. And then creates discussion. Scaffolds are something that, frequently when we're co-teaching, for example, in a room of both our English only and English learners, we see that there's a lot of collaboration, and a lot of times a student who's not even an English learner will say, oh man, that's a great strategy, or that's a great scaffold, that really helped me. Can we do that for me? So these are things that you can employ with all students, not just English learners. You should be incorporating scaffolds into every instruction as needed according to the student data and the student need, and knowing your student ultimately, right? Their personality, their likes, their dislikes, their cultural background, all of that comes into play when we talk about scaffolds. So access points, what we will define in a subsequent slide, within those high quality instructional materials, those are basically just notes, right? So we have our high quality instructional materials. It's a big push for Tennessee right now. High quality instructional materials have the standards already covered, right? The Tennessee academic standards are within those high quality instructional materials. So we use that as our starting point. And then we say, okay, I've got a student that might have a low level of English proficiency. So I'm going to look at these access points or these little notes embedded within the text, within my high quality instructional materials to see how I can best engage my student. And if that's not enough, then we incorporate our scaffolds, right? And by the time we do all that, it really reduces that need for that Tier 1 intervention. Not saying that it completely takes the need away, but it kind of provides a bridge, right? It's a further accommodation that's not a Tier 1 intervention. So in order to ensure that all students have access to the content, we need strong core instruction, right? Giving them access to those high quality instructional materials, giving them multiple access points so they can maximize their grade level learning opportunities. Something really important that we talked about last week, we had a standards crosswalk working group in the office all last week. It was an amazing time. And one thing that we really emphasize is when we talk about creating a language objective or talking about what the standard is, we want to keep all of those things grade level. And then from there is when we build in those scaffolds based on those students' level of linguistic proficiency. But we don't just, lay out all the different scaffolds there are and just expect them to say, okay, well, they'll just pick and choose which ones they need, and we'll just spoon feed them the content. We start off with that grade level expectation, and then we build in the scaffolds from there. It's not a watering down of the content. It's just providing the access to the content. So just to show you an example of what an access point looks like, it's these annotations. So if you look over here on this page, it talks about meeting students' needs, right? Offering understanding with the terms to help them achieve the learning target, giving them rehearsal to help them practice, elaborating their ideas before writing them down. These are things that great educators have done for years and years and years, and that's why they're incorporating them into these high-quality instructional materials, so that you kind of have some ready-made tools and some things to start brainstorming and thinking about, okay, I'm prepping for my lesson. What is the standard? Okay, what students are going to have a problem with that standard? Well, Johnny, he hasn't quite grasped English yet, so maybe we need to build him some scaffolds, maybe some highlighted notes, or maybe some fill in the blanks. Maybe I need to provide a word bank. Maybe I can show him some visuals to help him access the content. It's that kind of thinking, that should go into every lesson as you're prepping, thinking about all your students and their individual needs. So instructional scaffolding, this is one thing that I collaborated with across the curriculum and across teams at the department to make sure we have a good working definition of what instructional scaffolding is. Because instructional scaffolding to me might be something totally different to how special ed refers to scaffolding. So we came up with a department-wide definition, and this is it. It's a temporary, student-specific support structure designed to maximize access to grade-level concepts and tasks. So within that, we talk about the structure, right? It can take many forms. It can be tools, like a graphic organizer, sentence stems, sentence frames, concept maps, RILIA, visuals, fill in the blank. You all have, I'm sure, wonderful strategies when we talk about tools. It could just simply be allowing that peer interaction, a peer tutor, someone in class that they feel comfortable with asking, hey, I got this answer, is that what you got? Oh, let's compare, let's talk about it. That's really good and that's really helpful. Sometimes a student might feel more comfortable having instruction from a peer than they would their teacher, because it's someone on their level. So the peer interactions, the teacher interactions, of course, and of course that has to be preceded by positive classroom culture and teacher rapport, right? So assessing and advancing questions, leveling your questions, providing that wise feedback, and then providing exercises so that they can self-evaluate, they can reflect, they have a chance to demonstrate their mastery over the content and feel that self-efficacy, like, oh yeah, I can do it, right? Giving them those opportunities to succeed, even if it's with something small. They're student-specific. Remember, these are not blanketed across all students. So one thing that we've encountered in the past with listening tours for EL has been the individualized learning plan, and how on several platforms it was easy for the teacher to go in and just go click, click, click and say, oh, all these students, they're all at the same level of language proficiency, so I'm going to give them all the same scaffolds, right? But we really want this to be individualized. That's why it's an individual learning plan. So thinking about that individual student, what their data says about that student, and then incorporating your knowledge of the student and what that student might need. They're temporary, so the whole point is to foster that independent learning, that creative exploration, that independence and freedom to engage with the work themselves and see where they end up, and then have you be the guide and the facilitator, learning to make those mistakes and knowing that it's okay, right? It's okay to take risk. If I don't risk and I don't struggle, then I don't learn, right? They're grade level, so remembering with the scaffolds, with the high quality instructional materials, we're using grade level material, right? But we're just building in those access points, those scaffolds to create the access to the content. And they maximize access, right? We talk about productive struggle a lot, right? We want our students to feel comfortable and embrace the struggle. When I was in grad school, we always talked about reward the struggle, right? If they're struggling, that's good because that means that they're getting somewhere. So don't interrupt that for them. Help encourage them and come alongside them. And when they get frustrated, say, oh, you're doing so good. Have you thought about this? But don't just give them the answer, right? Allow them to struggle with the content in a productive way, not a frustrating way. So this slide was actually taken from a conversation I had with our special ed team. And they really just emphasize, again, this top level, all students. We're providing those access points from the high quality instructional materials, and we're providing those instructional scaffolds. And when we do that, it greatly reduces our need for accommodations, which would be on an individualized learning plan, and modifications, right? Greater access means greater flexibility in how we approach the curriculum. It's a reduced need for singling out individual students to provide those accommodations. So some students have been provided accommodations for years that maybe they didn't need accommodation on an individualized learning plan, they just needed a scaffold, right? And what that would do is instead of having something that's on a plan for life, or maybe they're just using and they kind of get comfortable, right? We're providing a scaffold that instead is gradually reduced, and then they have that competency and that self-confidence to feel like, oh yeah, I can tackle this, right? I don't need that anymore. It's not meant to be a lifeline forever. It's meant to be a temporary support. So when we're evaluating our high quality instructional materials and we're applying those scaffolds, we need to think about what's the grade level expectation here? Okay, the standard, what is it saying? And one thing that we really talked about last week when we had our standards crosswalk working group at the state was students don't understand what the standard is saying half the time. So we have to either A, explicitly teach what those words mean, like analyze, infer, evaluate, or we have to break it down in student-friendly language. And our group last week did an amazing job of creating I can or the student will, those great language objectives, so that students can understand, okay, this is what the standard says, which seems like a whole lot of mumbo jumbo of very technical terms, but this is what it's actually wanting me to do, right? And I think that helps students. How many of you have been in an evaluation or watched another teacher teach and they just sit there at the top and they say, this is the standard, and they read it off like, robotically, right? That's not the point. The students need to know what they're learning. What prerequisite knowledge or skills will they need to access the new learning? So think again about those terms that I threw out a second ago. Evaluate, analyze, infer. Those are words that students encounter a lot, both on state testing, and they encounter a lot just in regular instruction, and they might not have any idea what those words mean. So maybe breaking it down using simpler terms, explicit definitions of what those things are, showing graphic facilitation, right? Analyze. Maybe I draw a student on the board with a thought bubble coming out of its head, and they're analyzing the information. Just giving them something to kind of connect to so that they understand what those words mean. And then which content might require instructional scaffolds for access? You know, when I was teaching high school, my students had a really hard time in algebra class learning about the y-intercept and the x-axis and talking about how to plot points on a graph. And we would always do a lot of silly, you know, at the time it seemed really silly, but they actually enjoyed it. It helped them remember. We talk about, okay, you have to get on the elevator horizontally, right, before you go up and down. We would teach little things like that just to help our students have those in their toolkit. There's so many, and I can't wait to hear from you guys as well as some things that you've used or things that have been really helpful. You know, teaching, we're always innovating, we're always creating, we're always thinking of new ways to help our students access the content. And so I love to hear when other teachers have great ideas and they're able to share that whole group with other people and they can say, oh, that would be something awesome to use in my classroom. So we'll have an opportunity for sharing in just a minute. So just some key details. You want to allow for mistakes, encourage mistakes. It's how we learn. You want to be a guide towards autonomy like we talked about. The goal is to create autonomous learners. And you want to encourage the productive struggle. Here's a really good little graphic here that I found, talking about scaffolding learning and basically what it does. So it starts in the center with the student's prior knowledge. Think about a student who's just arrived here from, thinking of an example country, Colombia, and they get to the United States. They come with a wealth of knowledge and experience that we need to show that we care about and that we value in the classroom. So maybe English is not their strong point yet because they haven't learned it, but they have a ton of really great experiences, life experience, or things that they maybe learned in their first language or in their home country that they can contribute. We think about students who don't speak English in a math class, for example, that know full well what's going on, but they're not able to express that they understand. So valuing that prior knowledge and then setting sub-goals as the teacher. And every time they reach a sub-goal and they demonstrate new understanding, then we back up and go back to that prior knowledge. Okay, now that we have the knowledge that we've gained, right, let's look at our next goal and building upon those skills. I think about when I was learning Spanish for the first time. I remember I moved to Chile. I was there for 6 months, and I'd had all this instruction, right, all this academic textbook level Spanish for years since I was 12 years old. And I get over there, and I'm sitting in a grocery store, and I'm going, oh my gosh, I don't know how to check out at the grocery store. No one taught me that. No one told me how to hail a taxi cab, right? But it's when you have that productive struggle, and it's frustrating. You know, you cry, you get upset, you scream, you're like, oh, I hate this, I didn't want to be here, this is hard. And then every 6 weeks, that I would attain more Spanish proficiency while I was there. I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I can't believe that I gained all that knowledge in 6 weeks, right? And then another 2 weeks would go by and I go, oh my gosh, I've learned so much in 2 weeks. And by the end of that trip, I came out, a near fluent speaker. And it's changed my whole life. It's opened up so many doors. It's given me access to so many different people groups and given me leadway with my students to say, I understand what it's like to learn a new language. It's hard. It's frustrating, and there's culture shock. And, it's a difficult experience, but it helps you relate with those students and understand where they're coming from, right? So really accessing this as a spiral and understanding that it's always on a continuum. We're always learning. We're lifelong learners. Allowing for those mistakes, right? We think about mistakes we make, and sometimes the mistakes that we make have the most profound impact on us, right? I will never forget one time I was walking into a family home, and I was trying to say I'm embarrassed, right? And I said, oh, estoy tan embarazada. They're like, oh, you're pregnant? I'm like, oh, embarazada means pregnant, right? I didn't know. But I'll never forget that, right? Now I know that means pregnant. I'm not embarrassed, right? So learning from those mistakes over time helps you achieve, first of all, it makes you feel comfortable, right? Because when you're able to laugh it off and say, oh, that's okay, we made a mistake, we move on, and we say, pressure's off. I can make mistakes. I know this is a safe place. Ms. Hendricks' classroom is safe. And it helps us learn. We learn from our mistakes. It's okay to get frustrated, but it's so much better to get frustrated when you know you have the support of a teacher, right? That's there to help you and help guide you. And then allowing for mistakes, thinking about it in an analogy like cooking. We're teaching a child to cook. Maybe we just help them pour the ingredients in the bowl first, right? And then, as they learn how to do that and they've mastered that, okay, now we can start with a butter knife. And then once we see that they're not cutting their fingers off, then we say, okay, you can use a sharp knife. And eventually, they learn to cook all by themselves. This is an experience all of us had, right? So we can relate to what scaffolds look like and how we learn over time. So again, it's just reiterating here that as fun as it is, as much as we want to micromanage, it's way more fun to watch them learn and watch the light bulbs go off themselves and see, oh my goodness. And sometimes they will surprise you with what they know, right? I'm sure you've all had experiences with that. You think, oh, they're only going to be able to do this, and then they just totally blow you out of the water, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't know they knew how to do that. And so giving them those opportunities to feel supported and nurtured in your classroom to make those mistakes, but really letting them have the opportunity to shine as a learner and demonstrate what they know without having you just jump in to save them every time they struggle, right? A few quotes I really liked. We talked about in order for students to feel safe without risk-taking and making mistakes, growing from those mistakes, they have to feel comfortable in your classroom. So when I was teaching, I always prided myself, I felt like I did a good job of creating a family, right? We didn't tolerate bullying. We really came together in all things. We talked about struggles. We had those morning chats, just 5 minutes out of our day where we really connected as a group. And we've talked about the importance of, we all know the importance of connecting with our students and building that rapport and, social emotional learning, things like that. It's all been a big push the last couple of years. So teachers who foster positive relationships with their students, they create classroom environments more conducive to learning, and they meet students' developmental, emotional, and academic needs. Our students today, they are riddled with all kinds of problems, right? They're growing up in a much tougher world than I grew up in, and I didn't even grow up that long ago, right? So think about all the environmental stressors, the stressors they have from being in school, the testing, and all the things, the expectations that are put on them, in addition to learning English. It's a lot. So having that grace, having that empathy, and really encouraging a safe place for them is so important. A student who feels a strong personal connection to their teacher, that talks with their teacher frequently, and receives more constructive guidance rather than just criticism from their teacher, is more likely to trust their teacher, show more engagement in learning, and behave better in class, and achieve at higher levels academically. I've worked across the grade spans, everything from pre-K to adult, and it's amazing how many adults I had. I used to work at an adult high school for a short period in my career, and so many of them would come to me and they'd say, Ms. Hendricks, I've never had a teacher be nice to me. You know, it makes me want to cry thinking about it. But they go through a lot, right? Our students encounter a lot. They maybe they've grown up in a household where they're not valued, or they don't feel like what they say matters, and then they come to school and they have a teacher criticize them on everything that they're doing wrong. Think about the good things that they do and point those out. It'll make a huge difference in how they respond to you and how they feel in the classroom, how they want to achieve more, what they're willing to try. Encourage productive struggle and risk-taking, right? In the words of Larry Filazzo, he says, if students don't feel comfortable, they're not going to take the risk. And if they don't take the risk, they're not going to learn. They have to feel comfortable, so reward the struggle. It's good, right? As long as I feel supported, I can struggle with them with the material and know that I have my teacher there to back me up, right? To push in there with those scaffolds where I need them, take them away when I gain that proficiency, but I'm safe, right? So how to scaffold? We talked a lot about building rapport. We talked about knowing their knowledge level. So I apologize, the graphics are off, I don't know why, but knowing their knowledge level, I put a little data chart there, right? So think about what data you have on the student, but also your knowledge of them, your working knowledge of them as a teacher. Selecting a task, and then going ahead before you even implement the instruction in your classroom, anticipate the errors and say, okay, what might, get in that mindset. How is Johnny going to be thinking about this assignment? How is he going to approach it? What kind of problems is he going to encounter? Thinking about those errors. Then apply your scaffold, because you've already thought about it. You've already thought about this is the errors that we're going to encounter, and so, or the mistakes, the problems. So these are, a few things I might want to implement in my instruction to help me access that student, help them feel comfortable, and give him some access to the content. And then we gradually remove the scaffold, right? Sometimes we apply a scaffold that the student, we didn't even know they didn't need it, right? And we say, oh, okay, throw that one out, they don't need it. And we think of something new, because there's always going to be some challenges there, even with our students who speak English proficiently. They need scaffolds too, right? Good teaching for English learners is good teaching for all learners. So we talked about creating a comfortable environment where they know their mistakes are valued even. Mistakes are good because that's how we learn. They can grow. We think about building that classroom rapport, starting with learning the children's names and how to pronounce them correctly. I had a student who, he spoke Chu from Guatemala. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Chu. So his name was very long and he was very embarrassed. But I always told him and really reiterated with him over and over and over again, please teach me your name in Chu. I want to say it correctly. And if I have to say it 50 times, and how valued did that make him feel? I mean, my name's Sarah without an H, and I get offended when someone puts an H on it. Imagine how they feel, right? So think about their family structure, right? Maybe they're living with a guardian that's not their parent. Maybe they're refugees, right? Think about their culture background. In some cultures, it's almost disrespectful to look someone in authority in the eyes or to speak directly to their teacher. A lot of them come from countries where maybe the teacher just kind of gets up there like, I say Charlie Brown, wah, 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 and the students all listen and they write and they're not free to ask questions, so maybe that's uncomfortable for them. So you have to teach that to them, right? Their learning styles and preferences. I had some students, and this is all teacher preference, teacher knowledge. I had some students that were like deadly afraid to get up in front of a classroom and share, but they could do it from their seat, right? Or they could come to me during my planning and present it, or maybe they could do it to a small group of their friends, or maybe they just need to stand in the back of the classroom. They just didn't want to be up at the front near the board, right? But trying to accommodate that as much as you can to help them feel comfortable and kind of build that rapport until you're able to say, hey, I think you can do this now. Let's try it. Come on. We're all here to support you. We're all here to cheer you on. Creating that environment where they feel comfortable. And then knowing a few of their likes and dislikes. What is your student like? What do you know about them? What do you know about their family? Setting those clear goals and expectations. I'll go back to the one about the buddy, but clear goals and expectations. A lot of us come to the classroom with these preconceived notions of what we expect out of our students, but they're never communicated. They're never posted. They're never talked about very clearly. Maybe we just put it on a syllabus and throw it out at the beginning of the year and think that that's good enough. But making sure that's a daily thing. That's a daily that goes into classroom management, but just really reiterating, these are my goals for the lesson. These are my expectations out of you. This is what I'd like, right? We're not assuming those things. And then assigning a buddy or allowing peer-assisted learning. That could be a peer that also speaks their same L1, or it might be a peer that just is really enthusiastic about learning about that student, learning where they come from, right? I was that nerd in school that I loved Spanish, and I started taking classes at 12, so I was always like, please partner me with the girl that came from Mexico. I really want to sit next to her, right? I always wanted to be the buddy because I thought, she can teach me Spanish and I can teach her English and we could be friends. So think about those students who are willing to do that, whether that be creating a program within your classroom or at your school. We talked about global ambassadors when I was at a school. But thinking about people who kind of naturally gravitate towards those students and might feel comfortable helping them, not just picking someone and saying, well, you're assigned to Billy for the rest of the year. I hope you enjoy it, right? But making it an enjoyable experience for both students. Write a review question on the board to get them thinking. Lots of formative assessments, whether you do the Marzano scale, scale 1 to 5. I would always say, 1, I don't understand it at all. 2, I understand it somewhat. 3, yeah, I think I could reiterate it. And when you got to level 5, it was like, I know it so well I could teach it to the class, right? So we would talk about, scales like that. We'd also do comprehension checks in the form of exit tickets. You guys, I'm sure, have so many creative ways that you could share with all of us about how you formatively assess and gain understanding of what your students know. Keeping vocabulary accessible, word walls, labeling, showing pictures. I was talking with a friend about how I had a student in a biology class I was helping, and they were talking about Punnett squares, and he understood all that. He just didn't know what a hamster was, right? So I pulled up Google and I showed him a hamster. Sometimes it's something really easy like that we just don't think about. So think about the language that your students are encountering and help them connect as much as possible. And then connecting to their culture and experiences. A lot of them come over to the United States and they're very excited. Maybe they were born here to parents that are immigrants, but they're American-born students. Or maybe they're recently immigrated to the United States and they're really excited about American culture and they're looking to you to teach them, right? What's normal, what's expected. Because a lot of them, they all think that we play basketball and we drive around in convertibles on palm line tree streets and have chihuahuas in Beverly Hills, right? And we have to teach them that, no, the United States is a big place. That's childlike thinking, right? But they're so excited, is my point. They see things in the movies and they want to learn from us. So you kind of get to be, to me, that's exciting. You get to be that, it's really missional if you think about it. You really get to engage with those students and teach them not just the content and not just those in scaffolds and not just English, but you really get to teach them a way of life, right? They're looking to you to kind of be their American liaison, their guide. So some guidelines, providing lots of praise. Praise goes a long way, right? So providing those pats on the backs, those good jobs, high fives, you did great. Even specific praise that you can give them. And if you just say good job every day a million times, it kind of loses its excitement. But if you can think of something really specific to compliment that student on, it's always great. Providing appropriate task, lots of supports, various supports, I should say, instead of lots. So, even teacher to teacher, this is going to vary. Some teachers have their own little set of scaffolds and they work great for them, right? And they know, okay, these are ones I feel very comfortable implementing in my classroom. These work for my students. And you might try those out and they bust. So you kind of have to try these out, trial and error, kind of get in a rhythm and figure out what works for you, for your personality as a teacher, and then also what works for your students. Providing lots of opportunities for second chances. So it's really easy to ask a question, and when they don't get it right, say, okay, and then move on. But say, maybe rephrase it a different way. Give them that opportunity to show success and to feel like they've mastered something, even if it's something really small. And then lots of formative assessments, like we talked about. Some types of scaffolds. So there's two main types when we think about two big categories, and that's verbal and procedural. So verbal, just think about things that you implement orally in your classroom. So those are things like modeling a think aloud, showing a student how you thought through the process, how you arrived at an answer. This is one that I'm not always the best at. I'm a fast talker. But slowing your speech, enunciating clearly, right? Reinforcing those contextual definitions. Simplifying the question. So maybe if you rephrased it in a different way or use simpler language, they would understand better. And engaging in read aloud, right, where you're modeling the correct pronunciation and prosody. So sometimes a student might feel very uncomfortable to read something out loud in the classroom. You know, we've all been in the classrooms growing up where they say popcorn, and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to get picked, right? But if a teacher reads it first, and you can hear what the correct pronunciation, it takes that pressure off. So then what I'm doing is I'm just kind of regurgitating, I'm providing a performance. It allows me to feel a little bit of success instead of me being, nervous about saying the word correctly. Procedural, so those are tools and resources like explicit modeling, lots of visuals, lots of gestures, really. One thing that I've really been interested in just personally has been graphic facilitation. So think about how much, now we can all kind of be graphic designers in our own homes. There's so many amazing resources online. But even just picking up an expo marker and just drawing a quick book on the board and pointing to it and saying, okay, now we're going to read, class, right? Providing them just some cues as to what's happening in the classroom. Allowing for visual tools and organizers to help them manipulate the information. So many wonderful math manipulatives out there, but also things like graphic organizers, using highlighters. Providing wait time when we ask questions. When I was in the classroom, I struggled with this. I'd have to mentally think, okay, count to 10 before you just call on someone, because especially for a student who is learning a second language or a third language, they're not, English is not their first language, they need that additional wait time built in, right, to be able to process and think. Sometimes they're literally thinking about it in their L1, translating it, putting it into English, trying that out for size in their brain and thinking, okay, do I have this right? Am I going to say the right thing? Am I going to embarrass myself? And by the time they're ready to answer their question, you've already moved on. So really building in that wait time. Providing discussion prompts and sentence frames to support their discussions. So maybe they want to engage, but they don't know how to get started. So just give them a sentence frame or a way to answer the question. And maybe some of your students use that and others, they don't need it, right? And that's okay. You can say this is an option and provide that to them. Allowing them to collaborate, right? Lots of project-based learning, peer-based learning, peer tutors, all of that is wonderful, right? Makes students feel comfortable, and it kind of gives them even an opportunity to kind of step up and show their own leadership in the classroom. So here's just kind of a quick run through of just some off the top of my head that I could come up with, but I'm anxious to hear from you guys because I know you guys have some amazing ones. So cue cards, right, showing pictures. You can even download these for free. You're not having to come up with them yourself. So these are the things procedurally we do every day in the classroom, and here's a cue card, right, just like when you are at a live showing and you say applause, right? It's giving them that prompt. Lots of examples. Vocabulary books, you can buy these. You can also have your students create them. Right? We used to play a really fun bingo game where I would give them a word, and then even if it was a difficult word like exist, maybe they draw a picture of Santa Claus or they draw an alien, and that helps trigger that mnemonic device, right? It helps them remember, oh yeah, exist. Okay, I'm thinking of an alien. Oh, okay, exist. I know what that means now, right? So thinking about different ways you can incorporate the vocabulary and help them, remember the words. Prompting, lots of prompting, going over to their desks, showing them what page they should be on, demonstrating the book to the class, right? Sentence frames or sentence stems, right? Giving them an example of how they should answer a question, how to start a paragraph when they're writing, the structure of an essay. Choral read or echo read. If you know Valentina Gonzalez, she's a really big believer in this. We did a book study on her a couple years back, but choral reading is huge for English learners because they kind of get to blend in with the crowd and practice their reading aloud without feeling singled out. So she would have the students read everything, right? The objective of the day, and this is what we're learning, and let's read our vocabulary words, and just giving them time to kind of try on their English, right? Try on what it sounds like and how to make the words. Giving lots of hints. Sometimes the student doesn't need the answer, but they just want a hint. And you can even ask, hey, do you want a hint? Or I used to like to say, would you like to phone a friend? And I would let them pick someone else in the classroom, a buddy that they felt comfortable asking. Graphic organizers are great because they kind of help them conceptually map out information. Visual aids, as we talked about, even just allowing a student to have their laptop handy, and rather than using a translator, I would say, well, Google the word hamster and see what comes up, or anything, We were reading a Halloween story one time with little ones, and crow came up. And then they said, well, what's a crow, Miss Hendricks? So we looked it up, I showed a picture, and I said, oh, teach me what it is in your language, right? In Arabic, it's like kharob or something, I can't say it. But it's an opportunity for them to feel some confidence and some efficacy, and like they're not stupid, right? They have something to share. So giving them that opportunity to share what they know, teach the class. Cue, do, review. Some people like to refer to this as I do, you do, we all do, right? So it would kind of look like I would model it first for the class, and then we would do it whole group, everybody. And then I would say, okay, you guys do it on your own, and maybe I'm walking around and I'm prompting, I'm looking to see if they're kind of on track. And then I'll say, okay, we're gonna do it independently. We're gonna shift to a different task where you have to demonstrate proficiency by yourself. And then once they really feel like, okay, I've been through all these steps, you've scaffolded this instruction for me so I can see how I get to the end result, then they feel the confidence to get up in front of the class and show everybody how they did it, right? So when we scaffold reading, it's a big area that often needs to be scaffolded, especially for English learners. One is adapted text. So again, we are engaging with high quality instructional materials. We want to keep things grade level. These are not lifelong scaffolds that we're implementing. These are temporary. So when we say adapted text, what we're talking about here is just temporarily maybe giving them something at a different reading level until they gain that mastery. And then we move them up, right? It's the idea is to always scale up. It's not just to keep them there. So maybe an adapted text or a graphic novel or a dual translation with both languages in the book are always helpful. Partner reading, so putting them with a partner. This can be something so easy. Last 5 minutes of class, you finished your lesson early. Okay, let's grab a book, and I want you to grab a partner and just start reading, right? Read to each other. Shared reading, reading together in unison as a group. Using their primary L1, their language support. So giving them access to tools to help them be able to look up words, right? And gradually scaffold them away from that so they're engaging just solely in English, they're thinking in English. Chunking, sometimes it's overwhelming. You have a huge text, so breaking it into smaller pieces, taking it, section by section, and then frequently stopping and saying, okay, does everyone understand? And you'll be amazed, especially in a group of mixed learners, English learners, and students who already have English proficiency, English-only students. Sometimes they're the ones to raise their hand and ask the questions, right? And that kind of it opens it up to the whole group, and now everyone's asking questions because maybe there's more that you didn't even anticipate they didn't understand. So frequently pausing, chunking things, your material. Echo reading, like it's just echo, right? So I read it, you read it, right? I model what good pronunciation and prosody looks like, and then you just repeat after me. Front-loading that vocabulary. There's so much vocabulary that they encounter, and think about the WIDA test. So much of academic vocabulary is encountered on that test, and so teaching that vocabulary explicitly, helping them have their own vocabulary notebook or way of keeping up with that. But I would always try to anticipate, especially if I was collaborating with a content teacher, I would say, okay, what's coming up in the next couple of weeks that I need to prepare them for? And then thinking about my lessons so that by the time they're encountering, plotting a point on a graph or whatever, I've already taught them all the different vocabulary that they're going to encounter. So one of my favorite strategies that many of you are probably already familiar with, I wanted to practice with today, and that's QSSSA or QSSA. And it stands for question, signal, stem, share, and assess. So it looks like this. So you would start with a question, whatever your content-related question would be, you would ask it. So I would say, class, without calling out, without putting your hands up yet, I'm going to ask this question, right? And that's related to our objectives, our goals, and what you already know about the students. And then I say, okay, when you think you have an answer in mind, I want you to, and sometimes I'd pick a student and let them choose. It could be something that I want you to stand up and dance, or I want you to put your hand on your head, or just raise your hand, or put a peace sign up, right? And what that does is it allows for the time, the thinking time, processing. So you ask the question, no one respond yet. Okay, when you think you know it, put a peace sign up in the air. And then when you see that majority of the class has peace signs up, you can say, okay, we're ready to move on. Now I'm going to give you a stem. For those of you who need it or would like to use it, here's the stem. When you answer the question, I want you to answer like this. And then, okay, you know how you're going to answer. You've had time to think about it. We've addressed what the question is. I want you to turn to a partner at your table and talk about what your answer is and just compare. And if yours is vastly different from the other person, talk about why, right? But talk about what you think the answer is. Now they've thought about it. They've demonstrated that they've thought about it. They've had the time to think about it. They know how to answer the question. They've practiced it on a partner. Now, when I call on someone, they already have kind of built their way, they're scaffolded their way up to be able to answer that question. Instead of just asking a question and then waiting and saying, if no one answers, I'm going to pick someone. You know, how intimidating is that? So giving them some time to practice. And maybe no one has a good answer. But when they discussed it, they can tell you that and say, we talked about it, and we just can't come up with the answer, Ms. Hendricks. Can you help us? And I say, oh, do you want a hint? Right? We're not giving them the information, but we're scaffolding, providing that access, that bridge. So we're going to practice that today very quickly. So out of everything that I've discussed so far, or that you already had experience with, because you guys are the real experts on the ground, boots on the ground, in the classrooms, a lot of you, what's your favorite scaffolding strategy? Either one I shared or talked about, or one that you already implement, and how would you use it? And as you're thinking about your answer, when you're ready to talk about it, I want you to put a peace sign up in the air. I'm not going to call on you. I'm just seeing if you have an answer in your brain. Awesome. Okay, it looks like a lot of people know what they want to share. That's great. Okay. So when you answer, I want you to answer like this. Or maybe you already know how to answer, but this is a way you could answer. My favorite scaffolding strategy is, I will use this in my classroom by, I like this strategy because. Okay, so think about how we would answer that, okay? Now I want you to share in a small group. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Go for it. All right, let's start kind of circling up, ending our conversations. I know that was a quick one. So this is when you as a teacher, you would walk around and you would kind of start listening, because that's another way of formative assessment. So what are my students saying? What do they think the answer is? And then if I'm hearing a lot of things that are off, I go, oh, okay, that's a moment for me to do some reteaching, right? Or back up and punt and think about how I want to better scaffold that instruction. But that's an opportunity, that's great formative assessment. That'll look really good on your evaluation, right? So going around and hearing, oh, okay, yeah, oh, I'm hearing some great answers. And then you can even come back and say, I heard some wonderful answers, right? I heard some great things. I'm so excited for you to share. Who would like to share? Can I get 2 volunteers to share something that maybe they use in their classroom, that they like? You have your sentence frames if you need them. Oh, I see a hand back here in the pink shirt.
My favorite scaffolding strategy is I take like an envelope and I glue the back of it shut, and I'll cut it in half, and it makes 2 pockets, and I'll give one to my student, and it'll be over the unit topic, and they'll glue it in that section of their vocabulary section in their journal. And we will use that to take the index card. We'll put like a visual on it. We will put the definition, the word, and then the student will make an example of modeling that word in a sentence. So then they can pull that vocabulary index card from their pocket for that unit when we go to the writing section in their journal.
I love that. Let's give her some snaps or claps. That was amazing. All right, someone else. It's a great one. Anyone else want to share a whole group, a scaffold they use? I see the black shirt over here.
I really liked using talking chips with my students because a lot of them were very self-conscious about speaking, but I found that if I gave them 3 little paper clips and they could say, oh, I only have to speak 3 times and use this sentence frame 3 times, they're much more likely to do it rather than if I just said talk for 5 minutes, because they might think, oh my gosh, I have to speak for 5 whole minutes. So
That's amazing. Love that one. Give her some snaps. Woo-hoo. All right, I'll take one more. Anyone else want to share? There's some great ideas. Okay, so need it up here in the front.
I like using graphics for just about everything, and for unfolding the lesson or procedural tasks in the class. I have a picture of what a lot of the like synthesize, analyze, determine, infer. So I had to really think about what does that mean that we're doing, and make a little picture. So sometimes I have Legos put together, that's synthesize. Analyze, I have Legos taken apart because we're breaking apart something. And I put a magnet like on the picture and stick it on the board by the content standard or skill that we're doing so that kids can understand it, and I can always refer to it, and I can use it for newcomers too so they understand sort of what we're doing. Even if they don't really understand what we're doing, I can at least start referring to it so they start understanding it.
Love it. Awesome job. Thank you for sharing. That was wonderful. Okay, so see, you guys are a wealth of knowledge. You don't even need me. You guys have some great ideas. So that's the whole point of this presentation, is for you to start thinking about those things, right? Knowing that you have these in your toolkit to get you excited for when August rolls around, so you know, okay, I have all these great ideas to pull from, and if I don't have an idea, I can call Sunita here and maybe she can help me, right? Or I can call someone else. You just have, you know, this network. That's what's so great about this collaborative, is it really is a collaborative. We can all work together to help improve our instruction for our students. So your last part, the A, is the answer, right? Asking for those answers. So some of the results to expect from scaffolding is minimize failure and frustration, right? If I know that you're going to catch me when I fall, then I'm much more willing to jump, right? Supportive learning environment. The freedom to ask questions and not feel ridiculed. I can say I don't know and it not be a big deal because I kind of represent the class and I know that everyone's kind of on the same train, that my teacher understands it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to not know the answer, that's how we learn. And you get to be the facilitator. Notice that I was not thinking of a single strategy when I asked you that question, right? You guys were thinking, you were doing the thinking. I just provided you the format to help to get you to think, right? To help you to have those conversations and those discussions. So it really helps you be the facilitator of knowledge. And it helps your students take a more active role in learning, right? Having those conversations, thinking on their own, taking ownership of your learning and feeling like you're part of a community of learners, right? No one's here as an expert. We're all here to help each other learn. So speaking of all of this, talking about scaffolds and why I'm so passionate about this, why I think this is so needed in our classrooms, we talked about an English language development and Tennessee State Standard crosswalk. And we started with math and English. So we had several applicants, I think it was like 121 applicants all over the state that applied for this crosswalk. And we ended up with about 30 that came into office. And we partnered them up according to content area and grade. So like 6th grade ELA was a team, right? Algebra in high school was a team, geometry, we had our high school folks together, so we had different groups. We partnered them off. We had them talk about, okay, coming together, the content person and the ESL person. This is the content that the student should be responsible for learning. This is the standard I'm responsible for teaching. This is what I expect the student to know. This is how, I expect them to demonstrate proficiency over that standard. And then the ESL teacher would say, okay, there's great points, but these are some things I think that your ESL students are going to need in order to be able to access that content. So these crosswalks are providing a bridge. And what's great about them is it's not just a crosswalk saying, okay, here's the Tennessee State Academic Standard and here's the WIDA standard and this is how they connect, but it's expanding it a step further. It's providing a student-friendly language objective. So it's helping engage the students in learning and knowing what they're learning, right? Breaking down the standard and what it really means, what they're expected to accomplish. And then it has those linguistic scaffolds and supports for levels 1 through 4. Because as we know, by the time they're at level 4, they're really close to exit, right? We have a 4.4 exit for composite and a 4.2 in literacy. And so, by the time they're at level 5 and 6 of English language proficiency, They're pretty much on grade level. So we just wanted to build in some scaffolds and supports. And I was so thankful. We had some amazing people. You know, even when we weren't able to form a whole group, people kind of jumped in and helped each other, and they really collaborated. And I just kept encouraging them that this is us exemplifying what collaboration looks like between our gen ed people and our ESL people moving forward, right? We're an example for the whole state, and that hopefully by providing these crosswalks, it's a ready-made tool and example that teachers are not having to sit there and think, okay, for this standard, I need this. For this standard, they have it all done for them. So they can just say, I'm teaching this standard. I don't really know how I'm going to teach it. I anticipate that this student's going to have some mistakes or errors with this content, so let me look up that one. And they can just easily find that standard. They can see the connection to the WIDA standards, and then they can look at those scaffolds, right? And they're progressive from level 1 to 4. So I'm going to show you an example of what that looks like. Really quick, just the goal of this, right, was we want to simultaneously support our content and our language acquisition at the same time, because that's what our students are expected to do. They're not just learning English, they're learning English and they're having to perform, right, and learn all these different content objectives that we have in the classroom. So we're connecting that content to a content objective and our language acquisition to a language objective, and the two of those things kind of marry together to make that student-friendly language objective. It's talking about the content, but it's in student-friendly language, and it's connecting those two pieces, right? Here's the content, that's the what we're learning, right? And the language acquisition, that's the how. So I'm going to learn this by doing this. What mode of language am I going to use? What mode of communication? So really thinking about that, we were able to develop these crosswalks. So I'll show you an example. And these are, of course, are still in draft. They haven't been through communications. We just finished this work last week. But for example, we'd have the grade, we'd have our ELD standard, or ELA, excuse me, and then the ELD, the WIDA standards. So WIDA has 5 standards, right? It has the social instructional, and then it has the 4 content areas, social studies, math, science, and English. And so for English and math, of course, we want to connect them to that ELD standard for either language arts or mathematics. But a lot of them are also going to fall into the bucket of social and instructional language, because that's the language of school, right? So when we look at this one, the ELA standard said key ideas and details, standard 1, right? Read closely to determine what a text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. And so then we were able to look at that and connect it to a WIDA standard. So for example, the WIDA standard they connected it to was ELD 6.8 Inform Interpretive. So multilingual learners will interpret informational text in language arts by identifying and or summarizing main ideas and their relationships to supporting ideas, analyzing observations and descriptions and textual evidence, we see that word again, for key attributes, qualities, characteristics, activities, and behaviors, and evaluating the impact of the author's key word choices over the course of a text. So they felt like out of the options they have from WIDA, this is the one that most aligned with our standard, right? And then they also tied it to a social instructional language standard. So they're defining and classifying facts and interpretations. They're reporting on explicit and inferred characteristics. They're describing parts or wholes of a system, sorting, clarifying, summarizing relationships, picking out the most important pieces of information and being able to summarize that. So with that connection, it's forming a bridge. It's showing the teacher how it connects. Okay, so now that we have that established, our content teacher and our ESL specialist feels comfortable working together because we know that these things do connect. And now let's talk about how we're going to scaffold. So the first step was that student-friendly language objective. We took this standard and we still wanted to keep some of the language the same because it needs to be grade level, but we made it a little bit more simplified for a student to understand. So I can analyze information from the text and make inferences. I can support my conclusions with evidence from the text. That's what that standard is covering. Now let's talk about the scaffolds. So level 1, a newcomer, they're going to need the most support, right? So providing them with highlighted keywords and phrases, illustrated examples, word banks, these are just ideas, right? So we don't want this to be prescriptive. We just want to give some ideas to a teacher so they can say, okay, these are some things, and maybe they have something that they used in a prior lesson that worked really well, and they can say, oh, that jogs my memory. Okay, I'm going to use that there, right? But these are some ideas. Give an appropriate summary in the student's first language. They're still very dependent on that L1. Then as we move to level 2, highlighted keywords and phrases again, but instead of illustrate examples, maybe we just do the word bank. And we provide them an appropriate summary in simplified English with simplified grammatical structure. So they're no longer looking at a translation, but they are looking at English, just a simplified version, right? Level 3, we're going to model how to highlight those key phrases and words, keywords and phrases, and provide the sentence frames, right, for making inferences and reading evidence. I infer that blank because blank. And by the time they're at level 4, the student is highlighting those keywords and phrases on their own with just maybe teacher prompting or a little bit of teacher guidance. And we're providing them with sentence starters instead of something that's fill in the blank. It's kind of an open-ended, right? So for making inferences and recording evidence based on the evidence on the page, paragraph, ... They're really having to think to fill in those blanks. So you can see how it's progressive. And again, this is temporary support. So they're not going to stay, they're gaining language proficiency every day. Even though they only take that test in the spring, right? Maybe it said a 2.1 last year. They could already be at the 4 level, by the mid of the subsequent year, the next year. And so they're always growing in their language proficiency. And as they're doing that, they're able to access more and more content. So we want these to be temporary, and they fall off as soon as they gain that proficiency. Okay, let's move them up to the next one, right? And then maybe you have a student who is English only, and they're really struggling. You're saying, gosh, this worked great for my English learner. And, they don't need, obviously, a summary in a first language because their first language is English, but maybe a sentence frame would work for that kiddo, right? It's giving those ideas on how to scaffold. So it's a really great talking piece between our ESL people and our content people to show that, a lot of our ESL folks, they come from content backgrounds. They were second grade teachers for years before they became an ESL teacher. Or they were math teachers for, 16 years. And it's just cool to see how, instead of them being relegated to the back of the classroom, like an aide, and they don't know anything, they know the content, right? So this is our bridge. It's saying, I come with all this background experience, you come with all this background experience, maybe I'm a little rusty on the standards, but let's see how these two things connect, and then let's work together to provide those scaffolds for our students. So last slide, remember the goal, right? Our goal is to always balance the challenge with the support. So if we look at this little graphic, I like it because it kind of breaks it down. If we provide low support and low challenge, our students are bored, right? They're not going to engage in the activity or in the content because they don't feel supported and they're not challenged, right? And if we do high support and a low challenge, we're just spoon feeding them everything, then it's the comfort zone. And unfortunately, some of our students, they stay in that zone for way too long, and they need that push. But if we do low support and a high challenge, that's frustrating and anxiety-ridden. That doesn't work either. So our goal is to have a high challenge, high expectations, grade level expectations, using those high-quality instructional materials, looking at the access points, and then building in those scaffolds, right? Providing high levels of support so they're able to access that content. And those two things in conjunction is what helps them learn, right? We're balancing those two things. So here are our sources cited. And I appreciate your time, your attention. It was very nice speaking with you all. I'll open the floor for questions. Any questions, comments? Oh, I see one. Okay. Hold one second. I think she's going to bring you a microphone because we all want to hear what you're going to say.
Thanks. I had a language arts teacher, and he said, I have this English as a second language student, and I don't know if he gets it. And they were reading complicated books. It was high school. The Tale of Twin Cities.
Okay.
And so I said, well, why don't you think he's getting it? Well, he doesn't give me anything. He doesn't talk in class. When I look at him, he looks down. I said, okay, everything you're describing to me is normal. And I said, but literally, you have not asked him for one thing. I said, did you ask him for homework? No, I told him he had homework. I said, okay, his notebook is full of homework that you've never gotten because you didn't ask. So that's the one thing you have to be cautious of when you're dealing with students of other languages, is they take it literally. Do my homework. I did. You didn't say turn it in.
Oh, good point.
Okay? So that's just really important to know. And the cultural thing, I said, no, you're like a god to him. So he's being respectful when he looks down because that is his culture.
Right.
But when I asked him to tell me about the book, he could teach your class.
Wow.
I said he understood it that well. I said, so you really need to know how to engage with him to be able to engage in the class so he can share his knowledge with everybody else, especially those students who really don't get it in your class. He may help them to get it.
That's right.
And that's what you need to know.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that story. It's great. See a few hands.
It was a great presentation, by the way. I wrote some notes. I was thinking a lot about Bruner's work on, you said the teacher is a guide and the students need to have that experience. It made me think of myself as a parent. Like sometimes it's a natural instinct to just jump in and want to help and do so much for your students or your own children. So I like how you said, it's an access point. You give that access point and then let them explore and experience. But I also thought about it has to be a heart and mind shift, because I think sometimes we go into things and we're like, they can't do it. It's just too hard. Look at all they have to read. Look at all they have to do. So we kind of have to shift our minds to they can do it. And even if they can't, let's just let them try and see what happens. So I think as educators, we kind of have to just step back and just guide instead of just, naturally jumping in. So that's a heart and mind shift I think we're all working towards. So
I love that, heart and mind shift.
One comment I wanted to make was that I think as an ESL teacher, I want classroom teachers and content area teachers to understand that the scaffolds and the crosswalks help the content be make it easier to be taught, and that the ELD standards aren't dumbing anything down.
Right.
That the crosswalks don't change the standard. It's supporting the standard.
Right.
So if we have a student-friendly version of what was expected in the objectives, the people who worked on those worked really hard to say, this is what the content is expecting in the ELA or the math standard. So how do we get the language from the ELD to make that work? It's the same standard. So that's the same tested TCAP and of course standard, but in a language-friendly presentation so the English learners have more language support. So I just hope that comes through for content area teachers, that the standard is not being dumbed down, it's being supported.
That's great. Good point. Joseph over here. Oh. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Go first. Go. I was just asking about timing for that. We are presenting to the principals in Wilson County, and we were trying to talk about language objectives, and I wanted to tie it in with content. And it is a little loose in there because that's where they'll listen, your audience, your admin, your content teachers, and then describing that connection to the language objective. So what is the timing on this? Do we know?
As far as
That crosswalk being available?
The crosswalk. We don't really know yet. We're in the process of getting it to communications, and then they have to go through it and kind of fine tune because, like I was saying, we had so many different groups work on it. And so when our communications goes through it, they'll format it, to make sure it's obviously legally sound, but also that it has similar formatting across and how they want to publish it, the format. I haven't received word yet on how, that's going to look. But my hope is that it'll be an easy document. We talked about as a group publishing it by grade level, so that if I'm a middle school teacher, I'm not having to dig through, 6th and 7th grade if I'm teaching just 8th grade. And I can look at just 8th grade English, for example, and see, okay, and then I can just find my standard pretty easily and work from there. So we are excited and soon to come.
It looks good. We did a lot of that in Metro, and I was curious, Michael Bino, was he there? I don't know. It looks like what we did in Metro,
Oh, good.
but I love it.
Oh, yes. Hi, Joseph.
Thanks for the presentation. That was really good.
Absolutely.
I had actually a similar question to what she just asked, was how soon that crosswalk will be available. So it looks like it's going to be a really valuable resource for. So thanks to you and the team and everybody who was putting that together. I know the ink is still sort of wet on it, so it'll be a little while before we get it, right?
Yes,
So,
yes.
but that looks really good. But I was struck by that actually. So my real question now is, I noticed throughout the presentation, most of the talk about scaffolding is about what we do for and to students.
Right.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about what we can do with students or even by students.
Okay.
And that's kind of grounded in one of the slides you had up there where it was quoted that unless students feel comfortable, they're not going to take risks, something
Right.
like that, right?
Right.
I sometimes think that we make some of our roles make it so comfortable for the students that they won't take risks either.
Right.
Students learn that by waiting, they'll get a different version.
That's right.
Or they'll get 2 answers off of every multiple choice, or they won't have to do the essay part, or they'll get a different text, so can you explain, please, how we can do a little bit more so that the students are more actively engaged with that? Instead of just doing it. So the crosswalk, I noticed, has a lot of provide this to the students and give this to the students.
Right.
It's all that to and for.
Right.
How about the with and the by?
I guess I'm going to throw it back to you just for clarification purposes. Like, give me an example of what you mean by the with and the by. Like, the student is...
We're talking with the students about what do you want to do? How do you see yourself
like the
moving
self-advocacy
forward?
piece?
Exactly.
Yes.
Like, instead of just sitting back and waiting for me to do the next thing, well, you didn't do that? Okay, so now I'm going to give you a different test. Or you didn't do that, I'm going to give you a different text.
Right. Yeah, I would think a lot of it is, so much of this is teacher discretion and knowing your students and knowing their needs. So the student, like she was describing, that needed to be asked, right? They weren't going to just provide it because no one ever asked them or required that of them. That's very different from a student who is so comfortable, like you were describing, very reliant, and they're just like, okay, if I just wait long enough. And I think, kind of back to, I didn't get your name. Ariel, I've seen you do wonderful presentations, by the way. What Ariel was saying, it is a heart and mind shift that I think all of us, not just our ESL teachers, but our gen ed teachers are going to have to get on board with, because it is so comfortable for us to step in and intervene and provide the supports, a lot of times with the assumption, thinking that, oh, they just need this, right? So many gen ed teachers I've talked with will say, well, they have to have Google Translate. And I'm thinking, no, they don't, because as long as they're using that, they're never going to engage in English, right? And so I think we can certainly do stuff department-wide to encourage that mindset, but I do think it's ultimately a mindset shift as far as just getting teachers to realize that it is, I like how you said with and by, and that might be something we look for when we look at these crosswalks, to kind of adapt the language a little bit. I love that suggestion, because I do want it to be a access point, a bridge for those students who really need it, but I don't want it to be, like we said, we got to balance that high level of challenge, right, those grade level expectations with the support. And I guess a better way to say it, instead of saying high levels of support, high levels of challenge, would say, we're going to give high challenge, and then we're going to provide access points as needed, and really encouraging. I think that self-advocacy piece you really have to frame and encourage within your own classroom, and get students to realize, like in high school, I had boys that would get an F on an assignment and they didn't know why. And I said, well, go ask the teacher. Oh, I can't do that. It's like, yes, you can. You've got to learn how to, you speak great English. They're not going to make fun of you. They're not going to, but it's important for you to know why you made the F, right? I can't go up there, so I would just refuse. I said, I'm not going up there to ask. You can go up there to ask. I will support you. I will stand from a distance. I will let the teacher know that you have a question, but I am not going to go up there and have the conversation, because you can do that. And I think that's a shift. You have to really encourage them to self-advocate, remembering that, especially if they're new to our country, they don't speak a lot of English, that can be very intimidating. So it's really about knowing the student, but those are really good points. Sunita? Oh, sorry, Dr. Clark?
I did want to ask, is there anyone in the room who worked on the standards crosswalk? If so, would you stand up? Because I think we may have some people in the room. Yeah. All right, thanks so much. And we've got about a minute left.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Would you like to-
So I wanted to respond to what Joseph was asking, that perhaps in the case of providing too much for the students, an option might be, sometimes students can know what works best for them. And so I oftentimes ask them, like, you know, if they're struggling a lot or they maybe didn't do so well on something, it's like, you know, what do you think you need to do better on this? Or how can, what have we done this year, or what have you done in your classroom that would help you do better understanding this vocabulary or doing this life cycle or whatever it is? And then if they can, you know, draw it or write it, act it out, or tell me what it is that of the scaffolds that we've used that could help them, then I will help them do that. But I'm not giving it to them. They should kind of have their own toolbox. Like I have a toolbox of what I think can, you know, maybe use for everybody and also adapt for whoever needs whatever. But then they should start developing their own toolbox of this really works for me, or I'm really visual, I'm more auditory, I need you to read it to me. And then I think they can start telling, hopefully, eventually in a safe environment, and with some experience and coaching, know what they need. They have to be responsible for their own education. I start telling them that as soon as I think they won't cry, so.
Those are great points. And I, you know, just to add to that, I do think that so often, sometimes they just assume, I always get this, right? And so sometimes I would just have, you know, especially if they're able to engage in those conversations and you feel comfortable, you have that teacher rapport saying, you know, we've been doing this for a while. I really think it's time we branch away from this. They'll say, no, and you say, you can do it. I believe in you, right? They just need someone to believe in them and give them the opportunity. We had one other question I want to make sure I got to, and then we'll wrap up here. I don't want to take over your break. I think it kicks on.
I'm an ELA teacher, and one of my frustrations is that I tend to look at these students and they just blend in with me. I'm in my class, and she made a point just a moment ago. I don't know how to relate to their culture. Is there any way that are there any kinds of resources that ELA teachers or regular gen ed teachers can use to learn about the cultures of the students?
I love that. I think, so I can actually, I'll have to get your email. I have a great resource I'd love to share with you. I could share it to anyone that would like it. But it's really cool because it allows you to look up like what the culture is, and it brings up all those things from like religion, spirituality, taboos. It's got like a lot of different things specific to culture. I know like in my particular LEA, we had a lot of Egyptian students, and that was something, you know, I was pretty unfamiliar with. And so just learning about their culture was very fascinating to me. But I think it does require a lot of, you know, just research on your own and talking and kind of getting involved with the community and kind of seeing places where they hang out and where they go, and community partners, really establishing that family engagement piece is important. But I also, as a state, we are trying to, you know, create more resources to help people understand. Like we're doing a presentation at our federal program summit on developing culturally responsive schools, and what does that mean to be, you know, a culturally responsive school? What kind of things does that require, you know, of the school leaders, and how are we going to implement a culture where they feel valued and, you know, there's understanding there, because there are so many little, you know, and it just varies from culture to culture as far as things that may be taboo in one culture are very accepted in another, or things like eye contact and physical proximity. There's just so much, you know, individually and specific to each culture. But I think just getting the conversation going and then having those conversations with your students. You know, I would have a lot of conversations with my kiddos and say, I would love for you, one of their favorite things that we did, and it would just be like after testing at the end of the year, if we had time, I would let them just do presentations on their culture. And even some that were born here, they had so much to share about things that I had never even heard of, you know, and I've lived in the United States and I've grown up with Hispanic friends, for example, for years and years and years, and they're teaching me about charros and, you know, all different interesting things that I didn't know about. And so giving them that platform to feel comfortable to share, like they have something to share, I think is also a good point. But that's a great idea. Thank you for that. Well, thank you all. I think we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Clark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Wow, a lot of stuff, a lot of great stuff. So appreciate you being here and also tying it to the crosswalk there.